The buggy wheels were the only sound. My husband hadn't spoken since we left the house, and I had learned, by then, not to fill silence that wasn't mine to fill. Then, without turning his head, he said it. "You are my wife, Rebecca, not my equal." I remember the cold coming through the floorboards first, before the words even landed. I didn't answer him. I didn't cry, either, not yet. I just sat there, watching the fence posts go by, thinking, I have never heard him say anything he didn't mean. It would be almost a year before I understood what he meant by it. And I promise you, it was not what either of us thought. If you've ever heard someone you love say something that sounded like the opposite of love, and spent months trying to figure out if you were the one who misunderstood, stay with me. This is one of those stories. I don't tell it for sympathy. I tell it because I think someone watching tonight needs to hear how it ended. The kitchen was quiet that night, the kind of quiet that has weight to it. I remember the lantern on the table between us, the flame leaning slightly with the draft from the window we never quite sealed right. My hands were still damp from washing the supper dishes. Outside, the crickets had started, steady as a clock. Samuel sat across from me, his hat still on, which was unusual. He always removed it at the table. I noticed that before I noticed anything else. Small things speak first, I've learned. The wood of that table was cool under my palms, worn smooth in the place where 3 generations of hands had rested before mine. He said it plainly, not unkindly. You are my wife, Rebecca, not my equal. No raised voice, no anger in it at all, which somehow made it worse. If he had shouted, I could have been angry back. But he said it the way a man says something he believes is simply true, the way you'd say the sky is gray before rain. I did not answer. I felt something go still and cold in my chest, and I sat with it because that is what I had been taught to do, sit with things rather than throw them. I did not sleep that night. I lay beside him listening to his breathing even out into sleep while mine stayed shallow, and I thought back to the singing where we first met. 16 years old, hands barely touching during a hymn, both of us too nervous to look at each other directly. I thought about the bundling nights our mothers pretended not to know about, and about Gelassenheit, the word we were raised on before we could spell it, yielding, surrendering the self to something larger. I had always believed I understood what that meant. That night, lying in the dark, I wasn't so sure anymore. I kept thinking, did I marry the wrong man, or did I misunderstand the man I married? The next morning I went to see my friend Anna, 3 farms over, because I needed to say the words out loud to someone who wouldn't just nod. Anna had heard something similar from her own husband, years before. I asked her, straight out, standing in her yard with the wash basket between us, did it ever hurt you? Hearing that. She was quiet for a moment, folding a shirt slower than it needed folding. You'll understand, she said. In time. That was all. Not unkind, but not enough, either. I walked home with more questions than I'd arrived with. In the days that followed, the doubt didn't shout, it just sat with me while I worked. Ordnung had always structured our lives plainly. He provided, he led, I nurtured, I kept the home steady. I had never questioned the shape of it before, the way you don't question the shape of your own hand. But now I found myself watching other wives at church, at market, wondering how many of them had heard some version of that sentence and simply folded it into their lives without ever asking what it meant. There was a morning, a week or so later, when I was out in the garden before the heat set in, my hands in the cool dirt, pulling weeds from between the bean rows. The air smelled like turned earth and dew. I remember thinking that my hands knew exactly what to do out there, even while the rest of me felt lost. Physical work has a mercy to it. It doesn't ask you to have your feelings sorted out first. I worked until my back ached and my mind was, for a little while, quiet. That evening, I decided I would ask him. Not accuse. Just ask, plainly, the way he'd said it to me. I waited until the dishes were done and the children were down, until the house had that same lantern-lit hush as the night he'd first said it. I sat across from him at that same table, my hands flat against the wood, and I opened my mouth to ask him what he meant. He looked up at me before I could speak, as if he already knew the question was coming. He set down the piece of harness leather he'd been mending and looked at me for a long moment before he spoke. "I've been waiting for you to ask," he said, and there was something almost relieved in his voice, like a man setting down something heavy he'd been carrying alone. He didn't answer right away. He turned the lantern wick up a little, as if he needed the extra light to find his words, and for the first time since I'd known him, Samuel seemed unsure of himself. That unsureness frightened me more than his stillness had the night he first said the words. "When I said you weren't my equal," he began slowly, "I didn't mean less than me. I meant, we don't carry the same weight. Not less. Different." He struggled with it, the way a man struggles to explain something he has never had to put into words before, because it was simply the water he swam in. He told me that, in his mind, equal was a word from the English world, a world that measured people like it measured grain, by the pound, by the bushel, as if fairness meant everyone lifting the identical load. That wasn't how he'd been raised to think of a marriage. "Your mother carried you 9 months and never once complained it wasn't fair that I didn't," he said. "That's not because she was less than me. It's because some things aren't meant to be split down the middle." Then he told me about his father. I had heard pieces of the story before, but never like this. His father died when Samuel was 11, thrown from a wagon on the Miller's Back Road, and his mother was left with 6 children and a farm that didn't care that she was grieving. She rose before light for 2 years, milked 22 cows herself, taught the older boys to plow, kept the household running on faith and stubbornness alone. "Nobody called that equal," Samuel said quietly. "Nobody would have dared. But nobody who saw her would ever say she carried less than a man, either." His eyes were somewhere far off, back in that farmhouse, and I realized I was watching him grieve a father I had never met. Something in my chest that had been clenched for a week began, slowly, to loosen, not into agreement exactly, but into something more like listening with my whole self instead of just my hurt. I thought of Anna then, and her unfinished answer in the yard. I understood now that she hadn't been dismissing me. She'd been standing at the edge of something too large to hand over in a sentence, hoping I'd walk close enough to it myself to see the shape of it. I thought about the way she'd folded that shirt, slow and careful, giving herself time. I understood finally that her silence hadn't been agreement or resignation. It had been her own doubt, still living quietly in her, years after she'd made her peace with it. I want to be honest with you here, because I think honesty is the only reason a story like this is worth telling. Both things were true at once. It was true that our roles had been decided for us before either of us was born, without asking either of us what we wanted. And it was true that inside that shape, there was more room for meaning than I had ever let myself see. The system that raised us was not without its cost, I won't pretend otherwise. But Samuel had not chosen it to control me. He had inherited it, the same way I had, and he was doing his clumsy best to live inside it with some kind of honor. If you've ever had to sit with 2 true things that seemed like they shouldn't both be true, that someone loved you and that the world he inherited still cost you something, I'd like to hear about it. Not because I have an answer for you. I don't think there is one tidy answer. But I think it helps to know you aren't the only one who's carried both at once. Tell me in the comments if this is landing somewhere familiar. That night, after he'd gone quiet again, I sat a long while by the window, looking out at the dark shapes of the barn and the fence line. I didn't feel the same cold I'd felt the week before. What I felt instead was something closer to standing on ground that had shifted under me, but hadn't collapsed. I wasn't his equal, not in the way the English world used that word. But I was beginning to understand I might be something the word didn't quite reach. Understanding him did not undo the ache. That's the part one wished someone had told me back then, that making peace with a thing is not the same as it stopping hurting. In the weeks after that conversation at the table, I found myself moving through my days with a strange double awareness. I believed him. I believed he hadn't meant cruelty. And still, some mornings, hanging wash on the line with the wind pulling at the sheets, I would feel a small flare of grief for the version of equal I had quietly hoped for as a girl, without ever admitting I hoped for it. There is a particular loneliness in understanding something you cannot undo. I had wanted, if I am honest, for him to take the words back entirely, to say he'd misspoken, that we were the same in every way that mattered. He couldn't give me that, because it wasn't true to how he understood the world, and I had come to see that his honesty, even when it cost me, was part of what I trusted in him. But trust and comfort are not always the same thing. Some nights I lay awake missing a kind of marriage I had never actually had, mourning it the way you mourn a house you never lived in but had furnished in your mind anyway. I went back to Anna's more than once that season. Our conversations grew slower, more careful, the kind you have with someone once the easy words are used up. One afternoon, shelling peas on her porch step, she finally told me the rest of what she'd never said in the yard. She told me there had been a year, early in her marriage, when she'd nearly left, walked to her sister's district 2 counties over and stayed a full season, telling everyone it was to help with a new baby. It wasn't. It was because she, too, had heard something from her husband that had cracked something open in her, something about duty and place that she hadn't been ready to carry. I didn't come back because I gave up, she said, not looking at me, working the pea pods steadily. I came back because I decided the weight was worth choosing, once I understood what it was actually made of. I hadn't known any of that about her. 16 years, and I hadn't known. That admission changed something for me, not because it resolved my own doubt, but because it proved I wasn't foolish for having it. Anna, who I had always thought of as settled, as certain, had stood exactly where I was standing now. The community we lived in did not often make room for saying such things aloud, and I understood, sitting there with pea shells gathering in my apron, that her silence in the yard weeks before hadn't been withholding wisdom from me. It had been her own old wound, still tender enough that she'd needed time to decide whether to open it in front of me. There was a coldness that came into our district that winter, in more ways than the weather. Old Ezra Yoder passed in his sleep in January, and his widow, Katie, was left with the farm and 4 children under 10. I watched the community respond, meals appearing on her step before she'd even asked, the men rotating through to handle the heavier work, the women taking turns with her wash and her children so she could grieve properly. Nobody called it charity. Nobody called it equal, either. It simply was what was owed, what the shape of our life demanded of everyone when one person could no longer carry their share. I stood in Katie's kitchen one evening with a pot of stew in my hands and understood, with a clarity that surprised me, that this quiet, unglamorous carrying of each other was the actual architecture Samuel had been trying, clumsily, to describe to me months before. But I want to be careful here, because I don't want to make this sound tidier than it was. Watching that same system hold Katie up so gently made the cost of it, for women whose husbands were less careful than Samuel, sit heavier in me, not lighter. I thought of wives I knew whose husbands used the very same words, not my equal, as a door closed rather than a door explained. The words themselves were not the danger or the safety. What sat behind them was. I began to understand that I had been fortunate in a way that was not guaranteed to every woman raised the way I was, and that fortune unsettled me nearly as much as the original hurt had. By the time the ground began to thaw that spring, I had stopped asking whether Samuel's words had been fair. I had started asking a harder question instead, one I wasn't ready to answer yet, and one I didn't dare say aloud to him, not even at our quiet kitchen table. I wanted to know what my own place actually was, underneath the word wife, underneath even the word not equal. I wanted to know what was mine, apart from what had been assigned to me. That question followed me into the fields that spring like a second shadow, and it would be Samuel himself, without meaning to, who finally helped me find the beginning of an answer. The answer, when it came, arrived in a form I hadn't expected, not a conversation, but a book. Samuel kept the farm accounts in an old ledger his father had started, the pages soft and gone brown at the corners, And one evening in early spring he asked me to help him go through it, since his eyes had been troubling him in poor light. I sat beside him at the table, that same table, and turned the pages back through years I hadn't lived yet when they were written. Somewhere near the middle, in his mother's handwriting, the widow who'd raised 6 children alone after his father's death, I found a second column I hadn't expected. Not just seed costs and milk yields. A record of debts owed to her by name, farmers in the district who'd borrowed labor or grain from her in those hard years and paid it back, sometimes seasons later, in kind. I asked Samuel about it, and he went quiet in that particular way he had when something mattered to him. He told me his mother had never once been paid in cash for the years she ran that farm alone, because among us, cash was not how such debts were settled. She was paid in labor returned when she needed it, in a barn raised in a single day by 12 families, in the fact that not one of her children went without shoes even in the leanest winter. She used to say she'd never been anybody's equal, he told me, because equal was too small a word for what she was owed and what she gave. She said equal was a word for people who were keeping score. I sat with that a long time, the ledger open between us, the two of us quiet in the lantern light. That was when I finally understood what had been sitting just out of reach since the night in the buggy. I had heard not my equal as a ceiling, a limit placed over me, a smaller room I'd been assigned to live in. But what he and his mother's whole life seemed to be telling me was something closer to the opposite. Equal was the ceiling. Equal was two people keeping careful, guarded accounts of who had given what, who owed whom, making sure neither one gave more than the other. What Samuel had been reaching for, badly, in a kitchen months before, was a claim that what stood between us wasn't measured that way at all, that it had no ceiling, because it wasn't the kind of thing you could measure with a ledger in the first place. I don't tell you this to say the ache disappeared, because both things remained true, the way they had been true all along. It was true that I had been born into a shape I had no say in choosing. And it was true that inside that shape, if I looked closely enough, there was a kind of largeness I hadn't been taught to recognize as largeness, because it didn't look like the freedom the English world promised. I thought of Katie, widowed that winter, and of Anna's season away and her slow, chosen return, and of Samuel's mother with her strange second column of debts nobody wrote down in numbers because the numbers weren't the point. There is a temptation, telling a story like this, to make the system sound wiser than it was, more generous than it always managed to be. I won't do that. I have known women in our district for whom not your equal meant exactly the small, cold thing I first feared it meant for me, a door shut, not a door explained. I do not know how to reconcile that with what I found in Samuel's mother's ledger, except to say that the same words can hold very different weight depending on the hands that carry them, and that I was given, through no particular virtue of my own, hands that carried them gently. What shifted in me that spring wasn't relief, exactly. It was something quieter, a kind of settling, the way water settles after you've stopped stirring it and can finally see down to the bottom. I stopped needing him to have chosen different words that night in the buggy. I started, instead, to notice everything he had built around those words in the years since, the way he never once made a decision about the children without walking to the garden to ask what I thought first, the way he'd rebuilt the hen house the exact width I'd asked for without being asked twice, small unspoken proofs that had been there all along, waiting for me to stop looking for the wrong kind of evidence. I closed the ledger that night and sat with my hand flat on its cover for a while, the way I'd once sat with my hands flat on that kitchen table the night this all began. I understood finally that I hadn't spent that year discovering what Samuel meant. I had spent it discovering what I meant, what I was worth, apart from a word borrowed from a world that never quite fit us in the first place. My daughter is 17 now, the age I was when I first sat across a lantern-lit table and heard words that frightened me. She came to me last month, quiet in the way I recognize because it used to be my own quiet, and told me a boy from the next district had said something to her, not unkind, just plain, the way Samuel had been plain with me, and that she didn't know what to do with it sitting in her chest. I did not tell her what to think. I have learned that much, at least. I told her what I am telling you now. I sat her down at that same table, worn smoother now than it was the night Samuel first spoke those words to me, and I told her the whole of it, The buggy, the year of doubt, Anna's slow honesty on her porch step, the ledger with its second column nobody thought to call a ledger of love because love wasn't a word we used for accounting. I told her I would not tell her the ache wasn't real, because it was, and denying it would have only taught her to distrust her own heart. But I told her that the ache and the understanding could live in the same house, the way Samuel and I had learned to live in ours, not because one had defeated the other, but because both had earned their place at the table. Equal was never really the word for us, I told her, and I heard, saying it, how much less it frightened me now than it once had. It was just the word I reached for because it was the only one the outside world had handed me. I told her that if a man ever says something to her that unsettles her the way Samuel's words unsettled me, her job is not to swallow it whole, and it is not to reject it whole either. Her job is to ask the second question, the one I nearly didn't ask, sitting frozen at that table for a full week before I found the courage. What do you mean by that? Said plainly, without accusation, but without retreat either. I will tell you honestly because I think you deserve the honest version and not the tidy one. I do not know if what I found is the right shape for every woman listening to this. I have known women for whom those same words, not my equal, were exactly the small cold door I first feared, a door that never opened onto anything larger, no ledger, no hidden largeness, just a smaller room and a man content to keep her in it. I carry a kind of grief for them alongside my own peace, and I don't think that grief and that peace cancel each other out. I think, like so much else in this life, both things are simply true at once, and pretending otherwise would dishonor women whose story didn't bend the way mine did. What I can tell you is what I told my daughter on the porch afterward, once the hard part of the conversation was behind us and we sat together shelling the last of the season's peas, the way Anna and I once had. I am not Samuel's equal, and I have stopped needing to be. I am not less than him, either. I am the other half of a ledger neither of us keeps in. Numbers, the half that doesn't show up as a debt owed or a debt paid, because it was never that kind of arithmetic to begin with. If you have ever heard someone you love say something that frightened you before it finally made sense, if you are still sitting, tonight, with words you haven't found the shape of yet, I hope you'll ask the second question before you decide what the first one meant. Sometimes the door isn't closed at all. Sometimes it's just been described to you by someone who never learned the right words for how wide it actually opens. I was never his equal. I was his other half. And I have come to believe, all these years later, that the second one was always the bigger thing to be.